So we've had a couple discussions about economic development and development theory and the role of international organizations in trying to foster development or alleviate poverty, whether it's the World Bank or other organizations. And all those conversations really had at their core this idea that poverty and economic development should be understood in terms of GDP per capita. And that was certainly the way that development was thought about for much of the 20th century. But in the 1990s, there was sort of a recognition or a realization that the approach of trying to maximize GDP just wasn't yielding the results in terms of human well-being that was maybe necessary to alleviate poverty. And so one kind of quirky anecdote about this is in the 1990s, Bhutan's king announced that Bhutan would not be maximizing GDP, but would instead be maximizing GNH, gross national happiness. And everybody sort of laughed and said, oh, that's silly to maximize happiness. And then people paused and realized that actually that's not a bad idea, that rather than simply assuming that increasing output is going to alleviate human suffering, why don't we actually look at the sources of human suffering and try to alleviate those? And so there's been a widespread rethinking of development and what that means. And I'd like to talk through some of the ways that that has manifested itself through international organizations and how they approach this question about development and poverty alleviation. And so around the time that Bhutan was articulating this idea of gross national happiness, the World Bank was sort of doing a soul-searching moment to try to figure out what they were getting wrong about poverty alleviation. And they conducted this massive project called Voices of the Poor, in response to sort of this critique that they were failing the developing world, that they didn't understand what people needed. And so they conducted more than 60,000 interviews. Some were surveys, some were sit-down one-on-one interviews, some were focus groups. They collected quantitative indicators, they collected these rich narrative accounts about what people's lives were like, what it looked like at the margins of society, what it looked like in the poorest of the poor parts of the world. And then pull those together into a series of books or collections. I think you can still download them online from the World Bank website. They're compelling reading, but they're also really stark reading. They paint a picture of hopelessness and frustration, in the sense that there's no way out, that there's no path forward, that people are kind of stuck. But it also notes that this idea of poverty tends to fall hardest on women and children, that the resources that do exist within society to treat an injury or get medicine when somebody gets sick tend to get routed toward men, and women and children tend to be left more vulnerable to the shocks and disruptions that come with everyday life. And in spite of the fact that in many situations it's women who are holding society together, they're the ones who are raising children and working in the fields and dealing with the crises of life. And in many cases, men have largely given up. And I'm grossly oversimplifying, but it's really worth reading through some of these narrative accounts and getting a vision of what life looks like at the bottom end of the global economic ladder. And out of that came a realization that poverty wasn't just about GDP per capita. Poverty was about these experiences, and that poverty fell unevenly on people, and maybe thinking about poverty and just targeting a single number is the wrong way to go about it. And so one of the shifts that has happened in development thinking is a move away from targeting just GDP per capita and thinking instead about what's called the Human Development Index. And this is an index that is used across development organizations. I think the UN Development Program is the one that sort of developed this and pushed it out. But the idea is that we shouldn't be thinking about development in terms of just GDP. GDP is important. The more stuff you're cranking out, the more there is to go around, raising standard of living. But when you think about the difference between going from $1 a day to $2 a day, you're going from regular malnutrition to maybe not going to bed hungry every night. Going from $2 a day, which is like $800 a year, to maybe $1,500 a year, means you're probably able to deal with malnutrition. You might be able to deal with some of the other crises of life. Maybe you'll be able to get access to clean water. get to 2,000, maybe you start being able to send your kids to school. You get to 4,000, maybe you're able to actually save a little bit of money or buy a motor scooter. The gains in quality of life are really dramatic. But once you hit about 12, 14, 15,000, and the Human Development Index kind of adjusts this number over time, we stop seeing kind of those huge gains in terms of quality of life. We start talking about whether you take your leisure time, in town, or whether you travel for it. Those kinds of gains in quality of life aren't really comparable to, I go to bed hungry every night and my children are malnourished, and now they're not. And so in thinking about the role of GDP per capita, the goal is not to get everybody to US levels of economic development and wealth. The goal is to get people to pass that threshold where we see huge gains coming from an increase in GDP per capita. And if we can get countries up to 15,000 GDP per capita, that will be a huge benefit to human well-being. But after that, there may be other things to think about. And so one of those other things to think about is literacy rates and life expectancy. And so the Human Development Index has sort of this diminishing returns kind of effect for GDP per capita, but also looks at literacy rates and life expectancy. And those are really good indicators of things are working in society, right? If literacy rates are high, that means you have public services that are being provided. It means that there's some level of gender equality where you're actually educating girls as well as boys. It means that urban areas and rural areas are both being serviced. So literacy rates is actually a good indicator of things seem to be kind of working. Likewise, life expectancy gets at, is there sanitation in place, right? Do you have basic medical care? Is there a civil war that's tearing your country apart? Like, those kind of things are going to show up in life expectancy. And so if you can get rises in life expectancy and literacy rates, that suggests that the worst aspects of poverty and extreme poverty are being mitigated and alleviated. I'll talk a little bit about this idea of thinking about poverty not in terms of GDP, but in terms of resources in a little bit. But I want to quickly highlight sort of what the Human Development Index looks like and kind of give folks a sense of this picture. So what we see is the places in the world that we would assume are doing pretty well. The Western world, the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, are indeed doing really well in the Human Development Index. Central and Sub-Saharan Africa are doing much less well, and Central Asia and South Asia and Southeast Asia are not doing great. But there's variation with some countries doing pretty well and others not. And I don't know that variation would necessarily be obvious if we just looked at GDP per capita. Countries like, I'll pause there. I'll contrast Oman and Yemen, which geographically are very similar. Yemen has had a complete and total breakdown in political order and human services, and it's facing a real environmental crisis in spite of not really being in all that different of a situation economically, at least in terms of endowments, access to resources, population, climate, than Oman. So we can see real huge differences when social systems break down that are important to capture. Okay, so I want to go back to this idea of thinking about poverty differently. One way of thinking about poverty differently is to think about this Human Development Index. Are things in society working? Another way to think about it is to think about it as having the resources to meet challenges. That the problem with poverty isn't necessarily just people don't have enough. It's that they have enough to survive at a basic level, but when you're moving along and something happens, car breaks down, kid gets sick, you break a leg, like lots of things can happen that disrupt that. There's a fire, a lightning strike. That can throw you off track and have cataclysmic consequences because you don't have the resources to deal with that. And one of the nice things that cash does and wealth does is that when those things happen, you can fix them relatively quickly. You can minimize their disruptions. But many of the problems that can throw people off track have a variety of possible solutions, right? So if I am relying upon a car and my car breaks down and I can't get to work, that's a problem if there's not public transportation infrastructure in place. If public transportation infrastructure exists, then I can potentially use that to get through for a period of time until I can fix my vehicle. If that doesn't exist, that's cataclysmic for me. And that's not necessarily a function just of the level of wealth in a country. It's also how that wealth has been allocated and prioritized, and whether it's going to public services and public goods like transportation, or whether it's being held privately. That can make a big difference in terms of the resources that people are able to draw upon to respond to those problems and those crises. And that it's not just sort of, you get hit by a huge crisis. It's also, are you able to mobilize and marshal resources to start a business? And so there's been a lot of focus on trying to create micro lending programs so that people in the developing world can get access to, $20 or $100, which is a relatively trivial amount, but potentially could be enough to start a small business, potentially could be enough to get through one of these crises. And figuring out systems to be able to get those kind of access for people in the developing world has been really one of the areas that development theory has leaned into heavily, thinking that this might have a radical effect in terms of changing people's lives. I also want to flag this question of inequality, because this is also something that GDP per capita really struggles to capture, and gets at this idea of how wealth is distributed within a society. And so if you're thinking about development, you at least need to be familiar with this idea, the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality within a society. And so 100 on the Gini coefficient scale would mean that essentially all wealth is owned by a single individual. Maybe ancient Egypt under the pharaohs would maybe fit this level of economic concentration. I'm not really sure. I don't know that much about the pharaohs. Whereas 0 would be perfect economic equality, I guess the Marxist ideal. Most countries fall somewhere in between, right? Sweden, on the more economic egalitarian end, hits about 25. The US is at 48. South Africa, which had decades upon decades of state-enforced apartheid and brutal segregation, is sitting at a 65. So it's a relatively unequal society with wealth concentrations and poverty. But if we look globally, we see we're sitting at about 68. And so those wealth disparities that are out there in the world are pretty extreme. But it's also worth pointing out that those divides break down not just in terms of GDP per capita, but we see them in terms of tropical areas versus temperate areas. And so this is one of the takeaways of looking at this map, is that tropical region of the world tends to be worse off than temperate areas, right? China being just a few degrees latitude further north than India seems to have a huge effect, right? Central and sub-Saharan Africa is in really bad shape, but Southern Africa is doing a little bit better. Countries who are in the tropics in the Western Hemisphere are doing worse than countries who are in the temperate zone. So that's part of the story. If you are landlocked, that tends to be really bad for economic development. We see that in Africa. We see landlocked countries like Afghanistan that really struggle economically and are on the sort of the poorest of the poor end of the spectrum. And then lastly, urban areas tend to be better off than rural areas globally, for a whole variety of reasons. And so when we're thinking about inequality, it's a complex story. There's a lot going on. But it's one more reason why thinking about development, not in terms of GDP, but in terms of some more holistic measure, is important. Okay, so the international community had this sort of epiphany and started thinking about poverty in a more holistic way. And one of the things that came out of that was this idea of the Millennium Development Goals, which was a set of goals with measurable objectives related to human well-being, things like reducing infant mortality and reducing maternal mortality and reducing the population that was going to bed hungry every night, to these various different indicators related to human well-being, and try to improve our metrics, our measures, the situation for people across these very different dimensions. And this was going to be a holistic approach to combating poverty that wasn't focused on just simply cranking up GDP per capita, but really fixing problems in society, and doing it in a more, again, I'm going to use that word, holistic. The idea is that we're going to bring together NGOs, we're going to bring together donor states, we're going to agree, yes, these are priorities we're going to fund. International organizations across the spectrum, whether it's the UN Development Program or the World Bank or the World Food Program, they're all going to be working on these same set of goals. And the idea was that by 2015, we'll have made significant progress and hit specific targets with this. Across the board, I would say the Millennium Development Goals didn't hit those targets. But one of the targets that was sort of put forward was we'll actually have an injection of more cash focused on addressing poverty and poverty alleviation, and the international community really didn't step up. Although in some areas we did see really significant gains, particularly in controlling HIV/AIDS. The global program to push out anti-HIV drugs was massively successful and staved off cataclysmic epidemic in many parts of the world, some parts of the world. The other thing that really, I think, undermined or reduced the effectiveness of the Millennium Development Goals is the Great Recession in 2007, which essentially erased all the progress that had been made over the first half of that push to improve human well-being. And so there was kind of rebuilding after the Great Recession. But there was still a sense that this was a better approach to thinking about inequality and responding to poverty. And so when the Millennium Development Goals wrapped up, the United Nations pushed out a new set of goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, where there would be 17 different dimensions or areas that would be targeted, some of which would be related to poverty. So, no poverty, number one, reducing hunger, global health and well-being, education. There would be aspects related to gender and improving gender equality, but a lot of it was focused on the environmental situation, whether that's thinking about clean water, whether it's thinking about energy, whether it's thinking about reducing carbon emissions, whether it's thinking about sustainability in the oceans or in endangered species. There was really a sense that the international community needed to focus a lot more of its attention on the environment with this next push for development. And there's been, so far, mixed success. This was sort of articulated in 2015. The goal is to sort of make progress by 2030 in some areas like health and well-being, and promoting alternative energy. There has been some real progress. In other areas, we haven't seen quite as much progress. Certainly, supporting the oceans and reducing carbon emissions globally, we just haven't seen the kind of progress. And this graph is a little bit hard to read. Generally, green means good and on track. Yellow means you're doing something, but you're not going to hit the goal. Orange means you probably are stalled out and not making progress. And then red is you're sliding backwards. Some of the goals were more ambitious, and we saw this with the Millennium Development Goals as well, that some of the goals were just things that nobody really thought we could ever achieve. Some were much more moderate and more achievable. And so this kind of helps capture some of that about how much progress has been made toward some of these goals. But I think the larger takeaway, given that we still have 7 or 8 years before the Sustainable Development Goals are sort of wrapped up, and we'll see sort of what the next iteration of this idea looks like. Also, we've been through a pandemic, which, like the Great Recession, kind of upended a lot of things. But I think the larger takeaway is that the international community has really moved away from and almost abandoned the approach to development that was sort of behind the World Bank at the beginning, the idea with the Herod-Donor model that you could just throw cash at countries and the cash would land and growth would happen, and really thinking much more about human beings and human well-being and how to improve that in terms of getting a return on a dollar of investment, and thinking about how to measure that in a way that's concrete, so we can say to donors, we are working in this area, here's the thing we're trying to improve, and if you put $1 toward this vaccination program or that water treatment program, we're going to see the kind of progress that we're really targeting with this economic development.